Welcome to Conversations About Construction. I'm Dave Trafford. This podcast is produced and presented by the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Members of the Alliance build your homes. They build your transportation networks and the systems that deliver safe, clean drinking water to your kitchen sink. This series will focus on industry innovations and solutions that support sustainable economic development and Ontario's world-class standard of living. In this episode, building smart infrastructure. Our guests are Brian Kelsey. He's a public policy consultant and founder of State of the City, and John Michael McGrath, a staff writer at TVO and co-hosts the On Poly podcast with Steve Pagan. So John Michael and Brian, I know you guys have both been close to what has gone on in Toronto vis-a-vis the Sidewalk Labs project called Quayside. I guess this all started in the autumn of 2017, and it was with some fanfare. And I guess, John Michael, when we looked at how this was going to be the new way of looking at developing urban centers and creating, that data-driven community that we've all heard so much about, what went off the rails here?
I think that the people at Sidewalk Labs never anticipated or didn't understand how planning politics works in Toronto for a bunch of reasons. And, I am not a business reporter, so I haven't reported this as deeply as other people have. But from the outside, it certainly looked to me like the folks at Sidewalk Labs misunderstood how the process was going to work from the beginning, and perhaps overestimated how much was in Waterfront Toronto's direct control, at not understanding that this was a process that was going to necessarily involve not just Waterfront Toronto, but Toronto City Council, the provincial government, and perhaps more.
Yeah, I guess, Brian, what kind of came up as this conversation evolved over the years, it was always a conversation that started with the question, what if? And we never seemed to kind of complete that sentence in many respects. So to John Michael's point, there was always this, what's next? What are we actually doing here feel about this project? I never got a sense that it was on some sense of solid ground.
Well, I mean, the ground was laid by Waterfront Toronto, in fact, early in 2017. And I think a lot of the problems with this process actually started with an RFP for this site that asked bidders, whether it was Sidewalk or its competitors, for everything. And that's why it seemed like it was this giant pie in the sky project. Was Waterfront asked for a pie in the sky project, and Sidewalk was in many ways trying to meet the demands not only of its own ambitions, but also the specific demands of the RFP for transit financing ideas, for utility ideas, for affordable housing ideas, and so on and so forth. And, to be clear, nobody from Sidewalk has briefed me on the specifics of what went wrong or Waterfront, although I have great sources at both. But everything I've seen in the process suggests that the ultimate outcome of this is the opposite of where John is suggesting it went. And that absolutely there was a lot of, I think, surprise and criticism and uncertainty at the beginning of this process in terms of how it would unfold. But Sidewalk and Waterfront had been working together for 2 years, and we're very close to a deal at this point. And what looks like it really went south was negotiations over the real estate issue, where the deal, as was announced on October 31st, was structured on the assumption that the price of this land was going to keep rising, which meant Waterfront could deploy more and more money towards its own priorities in combination with Sidewalk. But of course, nobody has a clue where the real estate market is going now. And so, I suspect, and again, nobody's confirmed this for me, that where things went south was that not on all the other issues that they negotiated a resolution to, the 30 other issues that were attached to that RFP. But in the end, what was a real estate deal first and foremost blew up because it was a real estate deal first and foremost.
But did it blow up because of the pandemic as a background, or was the pandemic, Brian, do you think, just an opportunity for a reluctant partner at Sidewalk to say, okay, we've had enough, this is just going to be our reason to get out?
If that was the issue, then they could have walked several steps ago. at various different points in the process. That and Sidewalk Labs hasn't folded up. They're probably going to pursue many of the things they were talking about at Quayside in other cities, maybe even in other countries. So it's part of what was so weird about this, and why it's a big deal for the future of smart cities, but also a very small deal for the future of smart cities, was you essentially had a global company offering to pay very premium prices for land to do things that it doesn't need premium priced land to do. And ultimately, when the math on that became more and more of a disconnect, with the pandemic certainly exacerbated that point. I think Sidewalk's leaders, with Google and Alphabet watching from behind, said, why are we paying more than $500 million to do all these things, and then, to John's point, wait through another 2 or 3 approval steps before we can really get going? When we could just as easily be building, for example, mass timber buildings on a site that's already owned by somebody, already rezoned by somebody, where the price of access would be $0 as opposed to hundreds of millions of dollars. And the deal Waterfront was offering Sidewalk and other bidders was to say, look, we're going to let you do this on a premium site so you can generate some real estate profit in addition to working through all of these innovations. And the math may not have worked for Sidewalk, but it's a real question to ask whether that math was actually working for Waterfront as well.
Well, I guess the challenge here, John Michael, is that when we look at the way this is played out, it didn't necessarily, I guess it, at some level, always started out as a real estate deal, if you want to look at it that way. But what was presented was the opportunity of the data-driven smart neighborhood. And that was the shiny thing that we all kind of glommed onto. What worries me as this thing kind of fades and falls apart is that we will lose sight of the opportunities here to create exactly what was on, the blueprints that were being laid out vis-a-vis the smart city and the connected community. Do you get a sense of that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a concern, and it would be a real tragedy if the sour taste left over from the Sidewalk experience, made people skeptical or even hostile to smart city ideas after all this, because there was a lot in the Sidewalk plan for Quayside, and even frankly, for their larger proposal to effectively annex much of the Portlands, that had a lot going for it, and not just the the digital IT side of things, but their energy and transportation planning, and even stuff like different ideas of handling solid waste. Lots of interesting stuff there that I think certainly Toronto, and I think lots of other municipalities need to be thinking ahead on, because these are you could take out all of the kind of creepy privacy implications about a smart city and just be talking about some of the stuff that Sidewalk was talking about in terms of, flexible zoning for rapid housing construction, or these energy systems, or lots of other things in that plan that were really great ideas and are the kinds of things that cities need to be thinking about in the 21st century. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to see cities turn their back on the whole sort of class of smart city ideas.
And here in Canada, one of the problems that frustrated me about the Sidewalk experience as a whole was that I came to the debate through the Toronto Region Board of Trade as as what I'll call a constructive supporter, insofar as I thought, and my colleagues at the board and the businesses who represented the board thought, that the critics, from Block Sidewalk and elsewhere, had a point in that a lot of the public realm data functions that Sidewalk Labs wanted to build into the Quayside neighborhood were really unregulated. Problem, of course, is they're still unregulated, that all of those activists who I think won a really hollow victory, had a really good time beating up on Google and Sidewalk Labs, but ultimately there are dozens, if not hundreds, of companies out there doing more brutal things with public realm data right now, who weren't getting the same kind of scrutiny because they aren't doing it on public land. And all that time and energy that could have been spent saying, we're happy to have Sidewalk here as long as we've got tough national regulations. And the time that could have been spent lobbying for those tough national regulations was instead, spent picking apart the 14th iteration of Sidewalk's efforts to meet higher and higher standards that Waterfront Toronto was trying to set, as if it was somehow the regulator. So, I think the future of digital smart cities pieces, as opposed to the other civil engineering proposals they were coming to the table with, there's a bright future. There's a lot of great companies here in Canada that are doing that kind of work in partnership with Sidewalk, or more often independently. Whether they succeed or not still depends on whether the federal government and the activists who should have been needling the federal government, step up and actually fill this regulatory gap, so there's no more uncertainty out there for anybody who wants to work in these spaces.
Well, how much of that, Brian, is that just that people don't understand the actual file? Because this is really learning in progress as we were going through this, right?
Yes, it is and it isn't. I mean, the part of why I was so fascinated with this whole file was I worked with Norm Sterling way back in the Harris government when he was Minister of Consumer Services on made in Ontario privacy legislation that never saw the light of day because it was killed by special interests in cabinet, frankly, who didn't want to see that kind of legislation come out. And we were building it to facilitate this kind of technology industry from to grow, and taking a very forward look on what kind of privacy protections should people be entitled to. So the principles and the conversation around how to protect those principles have always been there. The new piece, the funny piece that made this so weird, is that smart cities in general, and what Sidewalk was proposing in particular, is a very local application of these technologies. So you have federal officials who are so used to applying these principles to banking information or airline information that essentially you had a blind spot that could be filled and could have been filled in terms of saying, look, let's just apply those same principles in different ways that work for a local environment. But because these are local technologies and local issues, it just hasn't been a priority until Sidewalk's visibility, unfortunately, pushed it right up to the top of the agenda.
Yeah, I guess the other side of that then, John Michaels, when we look at it, it becomes this moment for lessons learned. And are we going to be able to take advantage of that? Because we're easily distracted right now, given the circumstances we're in with a pandemic. But at the same time, this is all about learning, no matter how you talk about it. We are in this era of lessons need to be learned. And this would be one of them. I admittedly, it's not pandemic related, but it's an important place to be in terms of thinking forward as we're going to start creating new cities in the post-COVID era.
One of the first things I wrote about Sidewalk Labs, and specifically its pitch to Toronto, was skepticism, not so much about the vision of what Sidewalk was offering Toronto, but whether Toronto actually wanted what was on offer. And I think that's something that cities need to think hard about because, to put it mildly, Toronto doesn't exactly have an uncomplicated attitude towards new housing and the planning rules that go into new housing or infrastructure planning or how these things are financed. And I think one of the big questions that I had from the very beginning was, and frankly remains, even if Google had been offering everything for free under the most uncomplicated positive terms that you could imagine, there was still a question of whether Toronto actually wanted the thing that was on offer. And I think that question is still basically not resolved. We don't know if big, dense, maybe complacent cities like Toronto, and you could probably think of some others in North America, we don't, I think, know whether they want the kinds of big changes that would make, a large neighborhood like Quayside or the rest of the Portlands the kind of dynamic, digitally enabled, flexible places that Sidewalk was pitching. And frankly, there are a lot of interests in municipalities who don't want that and will, put their efforts into fighting it.
I guess, Brian, then the question is there a need? I mean, do we need what Sidewalk was talking about in terms of how we now plan our urban centers and rethink density?
And part of the challenge with answering that question is that there were really two things that we hinted at earlier that Sidewalk Labs was offering, and really two very different things that Waterfront Toronto was asking for in its RFP. We were asking for, civil engineering innovation in terms of how we build things, what we build, how we service those buildings. And we were asking for, and Waterfront was asking for at least digital innovations to bring the advantages of the IT revolution to the provision of those services so that they would be more efficient and more integrated into the broader digital economy and so on. And, I think I actually think that the digital pieces will over time take care of themselves. It's a lot easier for them to be grafted onto particular pieces of how a city operates. What I was really concerned with, and what I think we really lost by not having this particular process succeed, is that cities are a relatively new set of old technologies layered upon each other in terms of sewers and lousy roads built on top of ground that's been subdivided by 3 or 4 different legal systems and so forth. And what was attractive about Quayside, despite the high price to a company like Sidewalk, was the opportunity to actually show up with an integrated proposal to say, we're going to integrate the development of the transit and the digital sensors and the pipes and pavement and everything else so that it all plays together. We urgently need that. Anybody who's been in a city hall gets a phone call from an angry mayor saying, why are they tearing up that street again when they tore it up 4 weeks ago? And you have to call the mayor back and say it's because the phone company isn't talking to the sewer company, isn't talking to the water company. That's the value of integrating those things so that we can actually, on a civil level, have environmentally friendly, easy to maintain, efficient services. And you're only really going to get there if you build it in an integrated way, as Waterfront was hoping to through Quayside.
I guess that what we have seen then for both of you is this convergence of the digital element into what we would traditionally think of as our infrastructure, and whether it's building roads or building buildings or the subways. It doesn't matter. Hospitals, even there are some circumstances or examples of smart cities where the garbage cans are wired so that the garbage man doesn't show up once a week. It shows up when the can's full. So all of these things become added onto how we think of building and procuring infrastructure. John Michael?
Yeah, no, and I think that is just to co-sign Brian's point. I mean, that is a missed opportunity in the debate over Sidewalk Labs. The Board of Trade had, I thought, a really interesting proposal for how to deal with the reams of data that a smart city will collect. And I think just to really, maybe repeat this point, but like a lot of this stuff is going to come whether or not we are talking about Sidewalk Labs, right? The city of Toronto, the city of Toronto is going to, either build a digital layer onto its own infrastructure or other actors will at some point. There are so many companies. There's frankly so much money involved in this industry going forward that somebody is going to want to do it. And there's a question of how that data is controlled and collected, and how the rights of individuals are protected. The Board of Trade, like I said, I thought had a very interesting proposal for how to do that. There are certainly other proposals out there, but uh, just because this discussion about Sidewalk Labs is over, it should not mean that we are done talking about this issue.
And a couple of quick points, Dave. I don't speak for the board anymore. I left in February of this year. But the proposal was to essentially say, look, if public data is public data, let's have the masters of public data, the public library, actually be the repository for it, and have the public library create boards and processes to consult on how that data could be used. The instead of having the private independent data trust that Mars and separately Sidewalk Labs have proposed earlier in the process. But one of the most interesting critics of Sidewalk Labs and smart cities generally is a rising star doctor of engineering at the U of T by the name of Shoshana Sachs, and she wrote a now infamous op-ed in the New York Times. I think the headline was something along the lines of in praise of dumb cities or something, and where I really disagree with her point, she actually took the example you gave, Dave, of sensors in garbage cans, and sort of said, look, isn't the problem here that we really need just more workers to clear out the garbage cans instead of having sensors track this? And part of what, there's some truth in what she's saying, but there's also something missing there, and that the real magic of adding a digital layer to these pieces is productivity. And I'll give you my personal favorite example is that in infrastructure, which is obviously critical to cities, and construction generally, that's the sector where if you ask the Mark Andreessens of the world, what sector is furthest behind in terms of gaining productivity through the information revolution relative to every other sector, construction's even the RCCAO is followed with this podcast, and even they will tell you they're frustrated as an industry that their productivity as a sector has more or less been flatlined for the last 40 or 50 years. And so adding digital design, adding modular construction, adding digital sensors to tell you when you need to fix a bridge or a road at different points. That's the kind of thing that Sidewalk Labs was trying to integrate into the city. And that's what we're losing by not actually taking the benefits of this seriously. People see the bell and whistle version where they're walking around with an Android phone, and it's like, well, why would I care if I can get to the right store 20 seconds faster and whatnot? And that's minor compared to the potential benefits of we've got thousands of bridges and culverts in this province. And I'm pretty sure the province couldn't tell you from one day to the next which one is more likely to collapse than the next without constant manual inspections that no government could ever afford.
Well, it's not just a matter of safety then, John Michael. It's a matter of cost savings in ongoing maintenance. It's about asset, making sure that those assets are taken care of in the long term. We're getting the most out of them, the full value for our dollar.
Absolutely. And I do think that there is there's a disconnect between what the public, I think, focused on, and some of that is probably the fault of journalists like me about perhaps being distracted by shiny renderings that were put out by Sidewalk, that kind of thing, versus what the long-term potential of this kind of technology is. What I would say, and I think I've said this before, but I'm relatively confident in my beliefs on this, but I would say that I don't think that Sidewalk is or was necessary to get a lot of the good things that a potential smart city could deliver. Again, one of the things I wrote about the project was that a lot of what they were proposing was not proprietary in any sense to Google or Sidewalk. That a lot of the good ideas were things that Toronto could do on its own or in partnership with other firms. It is not exclusive to Sidewalk. I think the reasonable fear is that Toronto was so skeptical, or at least parts of Toronto, let's say, were so skeptical about Sidewalk going into it and how it all ended, that they will throw the baby out with the bathwater and will not reconsider some of the upsides now that Sidewalk has folded.
Well, and let's be clear for the historical record, by the way, the board polled 3 times, published 2 of those polls on support and opposition to Sidewalk. Support for Sidewalk on a cold question and the Quayside deal was never below 50%, and opposition was never above 17%. This was, I don't believe that the deal fell apart because of the critics, but insofar as the deal took longer because of the need to adjust for those critics, this was a classic case of NIMBYism where obviously we were monitoring Block Sidewalk's public events. And they had 2 that I'm aware of, neither of which would have looked impressive compared to the average turnout of NIMBYists opposing a typical condo tower anywhere in the city. So certainly the public opposition to this was exaggerated. I'll be the first to tell you that those polls also showed that supporters were ambivalently supportive of Sidewalk. It wasn't the most important thing to them in the city by any stretch of the imagination, but they were open-minded to the negotiations proceeding. And the more they learned in those polls about, the deal that Waterfront struck, that Waterfront would have control of the data and aspects like that, and that a tight boundary had been drawn around this, the more the deal evolved, the more open and supportive the public was. So, I think I'm not the guy who normally says, journalists are wrong and should avoid their own internal feedback loop. But part of why I was so engaged in this debate, personally, in addition to my job, was because there was a bizarre feedback loop here where people were, some of Sidewalk's innovations were not proprietary. Since when do we judge whether or not somebody can buy a chunk of land that they won the right to bid on in an RFP based on the precise percentage of how many of their innovations are proprietary or not? What really should matter to the city is whether those innovations were present here in the city. Very few of them are. And the real definition of innovation for an economy is whether the innovations are being used, not whether Jim Balsillie or Sidewalk Labs or some other company happens to own happens to own the patent on them. It's whether the benefits are seeding out to the broader public and other businesses or cities or whoever are adopting that innovation. So, a good deal of what went wrong in this was how the debate was framed when you consider that it was really a proposal to bring a certain level of innovation to one parcel of land, even as other firms across the city were in some cases outpacing the approvals process in terms of bringing forward their own innovations outside of that scrutiny.
Well, and I would just say, yes, I have been, as Brian well knows, I have lots to say about Toronto's general NIMBYism problem, and I think you could certainly look at this as just another case of Toronto's NIMBYism, and that is probably part of the story. But I have written at TVO that I don't think it's the entire part of the story, because despite Toronto's NIMBYism, there are still large developments that do manage to go through the approvals process, frankly, with a lot less support among business and civic leadership in the public sphere than Sidewalk had at its disposal. And so I think it is a bit more complicated than just another case of NIMBYism. I think there were real failings in Sidewalk's pitch to the city.
I guess, again, all that cutting both ways, but let's look sort of down the road just to kind of wrap this thing up, because we've talked a lot about what was really beneficial, where the landmines were, we see where they are right now. Brian, how optimistic are you that we'll take this opportunity to learn lessons and actually implement, maybe not on the grand scale that Sidewalk had suggested, but that even just create a mindset and a culture that gives us permission, per se, to move forward with this, to actually talk about the benefits, whether it's a wired garbage can or how we actually build with mass timber?
Well, the encouraging sign, I think, to focus on a very specific test of whether we're learning, is what I'm hearing through some stakeholders who are already working directly with Waterfront Toronto about what to do now with Quayside. And, by way of example, I would be surprised if you don't see the Quayside site broken up, so that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing bid that consumes all of this different time. And, to answer another criticism from the likes of the Canadian Council of Innovators, for example, breaking up the site opens up more opportunity for smaller companies to participate in different consortia for this. I'd be surprised if you wouldn't see a radical scoping down of innovation expectations on the site, even if they try and get innovation-specific results from a bid for new housing or whatever on Quayside. By way of example, if they break it up into, say, 5 sites for the sake of argument, have one of those sites be a showcase for, digital innovation, one of those sites be a showcase for affordable housing or whatever it is, that I think, part of what Waterfront has learned from is that the scope of their ambitions also, creates complexity on the other end. And I think you're seeing a lot of advocates from all sides in a good way coming forward and talking about and being ambitious for the Portlands in general and Quayside in particular in a way that is intelligently balancing public expectations and what needs to happen to actually get private investments on those sites. So I'm hopeful in terms of those specific sites that we've learned from the lesson that incremental progress can sometimes be better, especially in this political environment. And the missing piece to me is still whether they're going to take the same attitude federally in terms of saying, look, for this industry to grow and grow responsibly, we need a regulatory umbrella so that these decisions aren't always one-offs to get to those incremental results.
John Michael?
I think one of the lessons that I took away from this is that I think a lot of policymakers and I'm using that term broadly. I think I would include Sidewalk as a potential policymaker, and a lot of people are still seeing Toronto's Portlands as a kind of a blank slate from which they can or onto which they can project their imaginations, and it's not quite a blank slate. It is politically contested ground. There are different people who want to see different things done with that space, and it may be the case, and I think this would be unfortunate for a bunch of reasons, but it may be the case that a group like Sidewalk with really large, ambitious ideas can only do what they want to if they buy desolate Nevada desert land and start from a place where there are no neighbors to suddenly to escape that NIMBYism problem that we talked about. I hope that is not the case. As I say, I think it would be unfortunate for Toronto too, but I don't think you can treat the Portlands like a blank slate either. And I think if what Brian is talking about in terms of making smaller, more incremental changes, perhaps more palatable politically, that may be the way to do it going forward.
Yeah, well, it's you just have to hope that you can kind of get through an election cycle, and this thing will survive, and the conversation will survive, because clearly that is a key part of it. Brian and John Michael, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Conversations About Construction, and we'd encourage you to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and share it with your network. Conversations About Construction is produced for the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario by iContact Productions. I'm Dave Trafford.